So today's webinar will cover the Encore software AP, invoice processing, and payments. During the webinar, the phones will be muted. You can use the chat box to direct any questions to myself if you need to ask those questions during the presentation, and if appropriate, I will answer those questions throughout the webinar. Otherwise, we will have time at the end of the session for you to ask those questions. A copy of the session, as I mentioned, will be available online to download in a PDF version and video, and those are in the same spot where you go to register for the webinars. What to expect from a webinar. So for those who haven't joined a webinar in the past, they are to enhance your knowledge of Encore as a refresher for individuals who have already taken training from a Encore trainer. Used as a refresher, a review of a module, it's not a substitute for training. The webinar is approximately 50 minutes of information with 10 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. Now, often these run a little bit quickly, so we will have lots of time at the end for questions. So today we'll be talking about invoice processing for accounts payable. We'll be reviewing vendor records, invoice processing, how to enter multiple invoices, multiple vendors in one single batch, how to set default allocations to the general ledger, which is where your invoices will be distributed to, how to pay an invoice, how to cancel a payment made against an invoice, and whether or not we're going to reinstate the invoice or reverse the invoice altogether. So vendor records need to be created prior to entering your first invoice. So before you can enter an invoice or process any invoices, you have to have a vendor record to file the invoice for. So for example, if you want to enter an invoice from Cisco, I have to have Cisco entered as a vendor in my system before I can do so. So to create a vendor, you're going to go to your Accounts Payable module, and you're going to go to the Vendors tab. Vendors is found under Setups for Accounts Payable. In order to set up a vendor, you have to have a quick access code, that's your QAC. You have to have the company name, that's your vendor name, a status, which is usually active or inactive, and a group. Optional information that you can still fill out for the vendor record, but it's not required to save, is the contact name. So if you have a rep or a sales personnel associated with that vendor, their address, email, and phone number, and the default terms, payables ledger, and expense allocation. So these features where you have default terms, net 30, net 60, 210, net 30, those make it easier to enter an invoice because they help pre-fill the invoice section. Also the expense allocation, if you set a default, meaning every time I enter a Cisco invoice, I want it to go to account number 5250, then that makes entering the invoice a lot easier because I don't have to pick the GL allocation every time I enter it. So on this next screen here, you can see the vendor and the invoice payments tab contains extra information. So the terms, the payables ledger, the default expense allocation, whether or not you use tax, so this would be applicable for some of our American country clubs. It's not used in Canada. You can also enter an account number. That account number is your account number with the vendor. So if you have a reference number when you're paying invoices and that's your account number with that company, then here's where you could fill it out. If we just flip over to the Encore system, I'm just going to pull it up on my screen here. Creating a vendor is fairly simple. Like I said, there's minimal information that you need to create a vendor, so we're just going to pop this up here. If I want to create a new vendor, again, quick access code. Some clubs are using numeric, some clubs are using alphanumeric. It's up to you how you want to enter them. Some people do A100, meaning it's a vendor that starts with the letter A, and then they'll number them 100, 101, 102, etc. Or some clubs will use the first few letters of the vendor name. Okay, then we'll type in the company name, and we'll type in the address. Okay, this address is what will show up on the check when you're printing a check to pay an invoice for that company, so do keep that in mind. If you're using a company that has a doing business as or a different reference name that needs to go on the check, you'll put the first line there, so ABC company, and then you can always do a doing business as and enter that information here, and then fill out your address. You'll choose the country, you'll choose the state or province, you'll choose the city, zip or postal code, etc. You have room for a phone, an alternate phone number, a fax number, email, and a website. Then you'll choose the status. Again, normally we just have active and inactive set up. If you're setting up a new vendor, chances are we want it to be active. And then the group. You have to have a vendor group for every vendor. You can choose to have multiple vendor groups, or you can have them really generic, food and beverage, general, golf, tennis. A lot of clubs can't really place their vendors in a group because that vendor could be used for multiple purposes, so they may just have one group called general, but you do still have to have that group. And then at this point, we could click Save and save that record. If we do have further information that we want to enter, we could enter primary contact information, so that's our sales rep name. You can put a business title, their phone number, their cell phone number, fax, and email. On the Contacts tab, that's where this will show up once you fill it. You can add additional contacts here if you have a couple sales reps or a couple account representatives for that vendor. Then on the Invoices and Payments tab, as we showed in that screenshot, you pick the default terms. So you may have multiple terms here, net 30, net 60, net 10. You'll choose the Payables ledger. Most clubs only have one Payables ledger, and that's accounts payable. If you do have two Payables ledger, then pick which payable ledger that vendor goes to. And then the default expense allocation is for what GL account should be posted to when I post an invoice. Okay, so you can see all my GL accounts are listed here. If you have multiple companies, they will be listed as well. If you leave this as not assigned, it just means when I'm entering an invoice, I will choose the GL allocation at that time. The default expense allocation description means if I have a default allocation that goes to 5250 account, what do I want my description to be for this vendor? So if this vendor, is a utility company, I can call this utility expense. Okay, if that's what I want my GL description to say. Again, this is to save you time when you're entering your invoices to pre-fill certain fields. If use tax is applicable, drop that down and choose the appropriate use tax group. Account number, if we have an account number on hand. Do not auto-calculate any surcharges means do not automatically calculate my taxes. Most clubs do not have this as applicable anyway, so we can ignore this for the majority of the time. Separate payment per invoice. This means if this vendor requires a separate check for every invoice rather than accumulating them and writing one check for multiple invoices, then you want to click that box. When it comes time to pay your checks, print your checks, it will print one check per invoice. If you leave this off, then it will accumulate any invoices that you want to pay onto one check. If you have the direct deposit module to pay your vendors, then you would pay by direct deposit and you would enter their banking information so that when we're running a check run, we can pay them by direct deposit instead of a check print. Going forward, there will be an interface with CSI Global V-Card, and that checkbox would be applicable if your club has signed up for that. If your vendor is a 1099, applicant, then we would have to fill out the 1099 information. This is a separate webinar, so I'm going to leave this just simply as this is where we would complete it. Extra information fields, if we had extra information we're storing for vendors, they would be listed here. And an inquiry, once saved and once we have invoices posted, this is where we can see information about that vendor. Just going to go back to the PowerPoint slide here. So we did have some questions come up. One, when printing the checks, will the alpha sort be based on the quick access code? We'll wait till we get into the check screen to view how that's going to sort. Also, when searching for a vendor, will the contact info be used in the lookup? Yes. So when we are in our vendor screen, we should be able to see here, these are the fields that you can search by. So contact information, when I say yes, I'm referring to the company address, company name, email, fax, phone. The contact of the sales rep is not a column selector in a search for field in this look for grid. That would be an enhancement request if we do want to be able to search for, say, the sales rep name or the sales rep cell phone number. The columns you can search for, which is just in this area here, are the company address and contact information. So going back to the slide here, invoice processing. So once we have the vendor file, Now we're ready to process an invoice. So invoice processing is done in batches. You can enter multiple invoices into one batch. They could be from the same vendor, they could be from different vendors. So it doesn't matter how you put these invoices in, whether you put everything in one batch or whether you're running separate batches for separate vendors. It is up to your club and your preference. When you're adding an invoice, you'll go to the invoice processing logo, which is under AP tasks, and you'll choose the vendor for the invoice once you've started that new invoice processing batch. You'll enter the invoice details, and if there's a default expense allocation set up in the vendor file, then it will populate that for you. So if we flip back to our Encore here and we go to our invoice processing and we do a new batch, again, choosing the date of record, entering our batch reference, choosing the payable ledger if we have multiple, and then we just hit add to add an invoice. So once we do that, we can start typing a vendor. Okay, it'll pre-fill the address from that vendor file. We would enter the invoice number. If you hit your tab key, that's the best way to navigate through this entry. It will automatically fill the reference with the invoice number. Then you'll choose the invoice date, which may not be today's date. It could be a couple days ago, it could be a week ago. The terms are whatever default terms are set up for that vendor. Okay, if you had multiple terms, you could change the terms here, but it's pulling that 30 because that's the default. It automatically pre-fills our due date based on the invoice date and the terms combined. The invoice status is payable by default, but you could always change it to on hold, which means when we go to run our checks, we're not going to see this as a payable invoice. Then you'll put in your purchase amount, and then again, just hit your tab key to navigate through. Nothing's filled down here, which means I don't have a default expense allocation. So instead, I would come in here and I'd type my account. Let's see. Do inventory instead. Okay, I could type over a description here if I wanted to. Now I can also allocate it to multiple accounts, so I can put 400 here, and I can use my tab or enter key to navigate through here. And then it'll automatically pre-fill that other with 100 so that they sum up. Okay, and then I would just hit save or save and new. Save and new means let me keep going in this screen, whereas save would exit me back to the main invoice entry. So if I do save and new, keeps this go up there so that if I need to enter a new one, all I have to do is hit my tab key and proceed. Or if I wasn't entering a new one, it would keep me on here and I can just start typing for something else and find something else. Okay? When you're done with everything, you can hit close or save if you had a record there. So now we're back on that main screen. We've got the vendor code, vendor name, invoice number, date and due date, amount to pay. So if I flip back to my PowerPoint here, this is what we were just looking at in the screen where we're adding the account and the amount to use. You can override the default account if you had a default expense allocation. Let's say we said Cisco does default to food every time, but once, in a blue moon, it doesn't go to food and we have to change it, then you can override it. If the invoice relates to inventory, then you can remove the account distribution, so in step 2, and instead allocate it to sales items, which is in step 3. So instead of entering the GL to go to, you would just go here and you would enter the sales items. And on that sales item record, we have settings for what accounts to use for inventory and cost of goods sold. So it would actually pull the inventory account from the entry of the sales item here. So again, if you have that set up, you could enter your sales items, which would trigger the GL allocation instead of just entering the GL allocation. Now, what would this be used for? This would be used for if you are doing the inventory receiving process simultaneously with invoice processing. So that means that your accounts payable clerk is entering the invoice as well as the quantities and costs of goods received. Most cases we see the golf shop or the tennis shop or wherever we're doing inventory, they're entering their invoices in terms of quantities and the cost of goods they've received, and the AP clerk is entering the invoice and amount to be paid to that company. So they are separate processes, most cases that I have seen, but we do allow you in step 3 to do it all in one, and that just saves, you know, time if you don't want your golf staff to be entering their item receipts and quantities, then you can do it in this one step while you're doing the invoice processing. There is a new feature in the most recent version where you can add a new POS sales item on the fly. So if you are using the invoice processing with sales item feature, you can add a new sales item. So if you get a receipt from TaylorMade and it's a new product that you don't have yet in the system, you can create that sales item on the fly. Once you've proceeded with entering your invoice, save the invoice, continue to add any others to be included in the batch as we saw, and then you can post the invoice to update your GL accounts. So if I flip back to my Encore here, if I go to step 2, either by clicking on the tab or by hitting next, I'm going to see a summary here with my vendor name and amount, and then where I am going to allocate that amount in the GL. So we've got the accounts payable, and we've got 2 debits to our inventory accounts. And then we would just hit post, and then the post would generate an audit trail, and that would give us all of our GL detail as a summary as well. So once you have posted the invoice processing batch, then you are ready to actually go pay an invoice. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to flip back to our slideshow to begin paying invoices. So again, you have to enter an invoice in order to pay an invoice. I can't pay an invoice that doesn't exist in the system. The must-haves to pay an invoice are a bank account setup, which every club should if you've gone through a setup, a new install with us, and a type of payment, which is usually a check payment. Again, these must-haves will be set up for a club that has gone through a new installation because myself or another trainer would have done these with you. When you're ready to pay invoices and you go to that task in accounts payable, you want to choose a filter to populate the invoices. And what that means is, how am I going to locate the invoices that I want to pay? Because maybe I want to pay them based on when they're due, or maybe I want to pay them based on when their invoice date was. So it depends on the methodology that you're using at your club. So when I come into pay invoices, again, pick the date, batch reference. Most people are doing check run, and then the week that they're running it. Payable ledger, again, you should only have one bank account, payment item. Okay, normally these are just singular. Here's where I'm talking about that filter, select invoices. How do I want to search for invoices to pay, due date or invoice date? Clubs will often use due date because then they will pull anything due on or before this Friday. That way I know it's getting paid on time, or on or before the next Friday. If you do by invoice date, then you're searching for invoices with a date of February 19th or earlier. So I'm going to do a due date on or before, and I know that we're at March 10th in that invoice, so let's just do March 19th. If you want to filter to say include invoices that I've said don't pay, include statuses payable on hold, then you can do so. Again, I normally don't. This is a manual check run, would be flagged if you were going to handwrite any checks, and that just means that it's not going to get to the print stage in step 5. It'll actually be a process stage where you'll process the checks instead of print them out. So I go to step 2, select vendors to pay. I have a filter here, so I can filter based on group if I want to find it, or I can filter based on specific vendor. So just so that I don't see a whole bunch of stuff pop up, I'm just going to filter on my Cisco vendor since that's what I know I have added, and just click that plus button. So I'm filtering here on any invoices due on or before March 19th that come from this vendor. And then I'll go to step 3, and there's my check. You can search in the look for here. If you had multiple checks listed, you could search for any part of data in this grid, such as vendor name or quick access code or invoice number, and that would help you to locate checks if you have a whole list of checks or invoices and you just want to pay a few. You can click on any of these headings to sort by that. So back to the question of how are we going to view in the printing checks, will the sort be based on the QAC? It is based on this quick access code, as you can see, because it's not a separate column for the quick access code and the name. So it will sort based on that first letter, which is the quick access code. So if we had multiple in here, we could see those. So once you've selected the invoices or invoice to pay, again, that's just a checkbox here. If you have multiple, you can do a right click to select all. We also have select invoice all and above and or all below. So once we have one, you can select downwards in the list or upwards in the list. Let's say if you've sorted based on invoice date or due date or amount, you can sort and then do a selection for all above or all below a certain record. At the bottom, there'll be totals here, so total number of invoices selected, total number of vendors. Another feature that we have here, so you can see the original amount owing. If you click on the amount to pay, it actually opens up, and it's an editable field. What that means is we can actually type in a different amount to pay versus the amount owing. What that would be used for is if you're doing a partial payment to a vendor, or if you are paying a vendor, you know, in 2 different installments and it's one invoice, you want to pay part of it, so you can type in anything here. What that means is that the next time we do our pay invoices batch, we'll see this same vendor come up again with the amount owing of 100. Original amount 5, amount owing 100 if we paid 400 now. If you leave it as 500, then it's going to pay the full amount, and once we pay it, that invoice has been paid fully. So now we can go next, and we have a preview postings, so you can see it's coming out of our bank account and it's debiting accounts payable. You can expand that to see invoices linked to that vendor. So if, you know, they had multiple invoices, you'd see all the invoices linked to that vendor. And then you can move to step 5, print checks. A neat feature at the bottom here, it'll tell you the total number of checks that you have in the batch and total number of checks to be printed, so that you know how many check pieces of paper you need to put in that printer, especially if you have vendors with multiple invoices being paid on 1 check or 2 checks. You know how many checks need to go in that printer. It doesn't matter how many invoices I have, I need to know how many checks. It'll tell you the total to be paid. The next check number to use will be listed there up at the top, and that's the check number associated with the payable ledger that we're working with. When you're ready to print checks, you would hit print checks right here, and what that would do is it would engage your printer to start printing. Once you print the checks and hit that button, you're going to have to choose the printer and the printer tray. So this is the printer tray to print the checks, and this is the printer tray to print the remittance advice, which is only going to be printed if you have so many invoices for a vendor that it falls onto a second sheet of paper. So that just means if all of my invoices don't fit on that check piece of paper, where should I print the remainder of those invoices, which would be on a plain piece of paper, a white piece of paper. So pick another drawer where the check paper is not. Otherwise, you're going to waste a check and mess up your order of check printing. And then we just hit the green check mark. So then I'm printing my checks, and it'll give you a status bar at the bottom. If something doesn't print correctly, then you can do a reprint check, and that is in the top left here, that button has changed from print to reprint. What that will allow you to do is reprint checks. So if one of them screwed up or if 2 of them screwed up, then you can always just reprint from certain areas in your batch if you had multiple records listed here. So again, I can do a right click, select invoice all above or all below. So if, you know, your paper jammed and the first 3 printed fine and then everything else didn't print or was off by 1 check number and we want to correct that, then you could just print from a certain portion onward. You don't have to reprint everything. Then we can make sure that everything looks good. So we've printed the checks, they're fine. You can do a preview, and that's just going to give you a summary here. So that just gives you a summary here of the checks that were printed, the totals per vendor, the general ledger account, date of record. So if that looks good, then we can go and we can post that payment batch just by hitting post. Okay, so it is a 2-step process in terms of printing the checks and also then processing the batch, which triggers the journal entry. Just to move this record over here, gives you a payment register with an audit number. Okay, once we close that audit, then it's gone. I should never see anything sitting in the pay invoices. If you do see a record here, then it means it has not been put through. So you may have printed the checks, but you didn't actually post it. So that journal entry is still sitting there unposted. So you should always have a blank batch here. So just to flip back to the slides here, paying invoices, we've walked through step 2, step 3, ensuring that we do check pay for each invoice that we want to pay in the batch. If you're printing the pre-numbered checks, you have to click print checks. If you had flagged it as manual, meaning that you're handwriting that check, then you would have selected manual. We talked about the reprint check buttons and the post. So if you're doing a manual check run, the screen will look a little bit different as we're looking at right now. Instead of saying print checks, it's going to say process checks. And then the check number is actually going to be available for selection down in this area, so you can type in the check number you're using. So manual checks would maybe be used if you had an issue with your printer, or if you were handwriting a check, a one-off check, maybe for a miscellaneous vendor. But this isn't really a commonly used function on a regular basis. Sometimes employee checks are done this way. But in this case, you do need to specify the check number. So once you've gone ahead, you've entered invoices, you've paid some invoices, we do have a feature for cancel payments. And cancel payments would be used in kind of two scenarios. There's one scenario where the check got lost, or the check was not cashed before the 6-month period, and now that check is null and void. And so we need to reprint that check, basically. The invoice is fine. We need to get another copy of that check out. That's one reason that we would need to cancel an existing check. Another reason for canceling a check would be that the amount was wrong. So the invoice that we entered that we then printed a check based on was wrong. So we need to reprint that check and redo that check and therefore cancel the existing one, but we also need to fix the invoice at the same time. We need to reinstate that invoice in a different amount versus just putting it back up there as it was initially. So your two options when you're canceling a payment are to cancel the check and reinstate the invoice, which means cancel the existing check and put that invoice back out there as payable, identical to what it was in the first place. And then I could go rewrite the check. The other option is to cancel the check and reverse the invoice. And what this means is something was wrong with that initial invoice and what I based the check off of, and I need to cancel that invoice altogether, get it out of the system in terms of reversing that initial invoice, and let me restart with entering a correct invoice and a correct check. Once you've selected what you want to do, reinstate or reverse, then you'll find the check payment that you want to cancel, choose your action, and proceed. So if you're canceling and reinstating your invoice, it's canceling the check, therefore reversing your general ledger posting, and then it will reinstate the invoice so that you can go back into your pay invoices task. This is again used where the check was printed but was lost or expired, and all you need to do is reissue the check. And it will reinstate the original invoices. You can't make changes to it. The cancel and reverse option will cancel the check and therefore their GL, and it will also reverse the invoice. So if the original check or invoice is wrong and you do not want that invoice back up there as it was, or don't want to pay that vendor anymore. Okay, maybe you disputed it and you just want to cancel the check and I don't need that invoice out there because we aren't paying them. That will reverse the original invoices if it had not been entered. So what happens when you've entered an invoice and realize that it's wrong before it's been paid? So we're going to talk a little bit about reversing an invoice as opposed to reversing a payment. So maybe the scenario is I entered an invoice and posted it, totally realized the vendor was wrong, or the accounts were wrong, or a date was wrong, or the amounts were wrong. What you can do is you can create a duplicate of the existing wrong invoice in a negative amount, and they'll cancel each other out. Okay, and so we call it an auto credit, and what that does is as soon as you enter the vendor name and corresponding invoice number that the system says, hey, I already have a vendor and invoice number that matches that, it will recognize that that exists and it will ask you if you want to create an auto reverse. So you'll enter a duplicate of the erroneous invoice in a negative amount, and then I'm just going to flip back to Encore here to show you this. If I just go in, I'm going to post a quick batch for Cisco again. And we're going to label this 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's important to remember if we do need to cancel it later. Let's make this $1,000, and we'll come down here. And save this. Preview it and post it. So I've just realized I just put an invoice for $1,000. It should have been $100. What am I going to do? I'd go back into my invoice processing and call this adjust or correct. I'm going to go back and add another invoice as if I was redoing it. And I'm going to type in the same invoice number that I used before, which was 1234. As soon as I do that and I hit tab to proceed, it says that it appears that invoice 1234 has already been entered for this vendor, so it recognizes the vendor invoice combination. It tells me the invoice date, the amount to pay, and it's been posted. Do I want to continue or create a credit? So if I was just entering another invoice that happened to be of the same invoice number for the same vendor, I could say just continue, and that's fine, and I have, two invoices that are the same amount. This sometimes happens if you have vendors that don't give you invoices and you're using the dates. You may have the same vendor and date combination multiple times. Then hit continue, and you could proceed with entering an invoice normal. But what we're talking about here is creating that auto credit. And it's recognizing the vendor and invoice number have been entered this way before. So we can just say, create auto credit. Everything is grayed out, but you can see that that $1,000 is being credited. So I can't change anything because I said create an auto credit. I could change the invoice date technically if I wanted to. And I would just save that. And I would go step 2, I'd preview. You can see that it's doing a credit. It's reversing that entry essentially, and I could post that. Okay, and then that gives me an audit trail. You can see here, invoice was created as an automatic credit. That's what that star indicates. You can see that I have credited the amount and processed it. So it's a really easy way. Instead of having to go in there and credit it yourself, you just do it using the automatic credit. What that does is it actually saves you a step of having to go clear out that positive and negative 1,000. Those just won't show up anymore. They're netted out as 0. You don't have to, quote, fake write a check to get those invoices out of having to be paid. The system knows now that I have a negative and a positive. So this step here that we're looking at, this is only if you had done a credit manually and had not used that feature. Then you would have to go into pay invoices, flag it as a manual check run, and you can see here there's the positive 100, negative 100, and you have to go, quote, pay those 2 checks to offset them. You don't have to do that anymore when you use the automatic credit feature because it will just offset those 2 amounts, and it knows, okay, well, I don't need to write a check for that. They offset each other. So the screen we're looking at right now would only be used if you had not used that automatic create credit, which would be rare because it prompts you to use it. So that brings us to the end for questions. Before we go over questions, I'm going to just quickly flip back to Encore and just show you what this would look like on a vendor. So if we've done some checks, payments for Cisco, and we pull this up, you can see there's my paid invoices. So there's this one, that was the 500, and then you can see, and this was what I was talking about, you don't have to go write a check for anything you've credited out. It just says here, date paid in full auto credit. So it's as if it took care of those invoices. They're not sitting out there anymore as unpaid because it was a plus and a minus. Now what you can do is you can double click on any of these and actually see the drill down of that entry, and you can view the audit trail by clicking on View Audit Trail. Same thing with this one. I can double click on it, I can click View Audit Trail, and I can view the details of that invoice entry. Payments issued will show you checks that have been written. It'll also give you the status of whether they have hit your bank reconciliation or not. So you can see here the 2, so there's my 500. Its status is outstanding because I wrote the check. I have not run it through my bank rec yet. I just wrote it today. But this one here, which says payment amount 0, because that was from the auto credit, the payment status is reconciled. I don't have to worry about reconciling it in a bank rec either because that automatic credit took care of the fact that I have a positive and a negative. They net out. I didn't ever write a check, so it reconciles that amount for me so that I'm never seeing, these plus and minuses on my bank rec and trying to remember, oh, which one's offset a mistake that I had made. If you have the document management add-on for your vendors, this is where you can see documents for your vendors such as checks and also other documents, which are documents that you can load for vendors yourself. So if you have contracts that you want to upload, you can load these, again, if you have that add-on module. We had a question here asked if we can go over the portion of inventory and payables. So that's that extra step in invoice processing that if we are entering an invoice, let's say for Nike, okay, and we have a $500 invoice, we can come down here and we could put partial accounts if we had shipping in here. I don't know if I have shipping in here. Let's just see. Let's just do a miscellaneous expense and we'll call this shipping. Let's say that was a flat $50, so we're going to put it separate. Then the rest of that $500, so $450, we can come to sales items, and we can actually pull an item. Let's search Nike to make this a little bit more realistic. So we can do Nike Polo. We got 4 of them, and they're $17.22 each, so there's our total. And then we can continue to proceed in here. We got 20 of those, and they're $23.50 each. We're a little bit over our total now because I'm not doing the math in my head. And so you can proceed to enter your sales items here and also print labels if you wanted to. So it's just putting this inventory receipt step into invoice processing instead of it being separate in the inventory module. And this is a new feature here where I was talking about you can add the green plus sign, and that will allow you to create a new item on the fly. So if you get new items and you haven't created them in the system, you don't have to go out to point of sale or inventory modules, add a new sales item. You can just jump right into it here. Okay, so that's how it would handle it. You see it tells me here I have left to allocate $88.88 because I have gone over my amount. So I can always change this up here, and then there, my amount left to allocate is 0 because in combination with the sales items as well as some GL allocation for, say, shipping, it does still total the $588.88, and I would just hit save, okay? And so everything else is the same. Our posting's the same. It still posts. So again, it's getting that inventory account from the sales item I selected, and then your shipping there as well. So I think that is it. I'm going to unmute the lines if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, that concludes our presentation for the AP Invoice Processing module.